very great piece of work that we've been working on since late in 2023. And I'll go more in the presentation, but we took a significant amount of time to gather types of information. So thank you for all who may have seen this report come up in some of the other avenues that NERC has requested the reviews, primarily in their Reliability and Security Technical Committee and among the trade organizations. So this presentation will share the findings from that type of report, and we've incorporated some of the feedback taken there. So next slide, please. The way I want to start is where do we come from, and why are we really getting this report to us here today? So back in, as you can see on the screen here, in December of 2007, NERC had provided a report on the data collection for demand-side management and for quantifying its influence on reliability. And a lot of that was related to the demand response function. That is, we were seeing a lot of demand entities wish to provide reliability benefit to the transmission system. And so we needed a way to track, quantify, measure it, and provide that sort of automated response. And so you see the demand response programs today are largely a result of this type of early work. Well, the distribution system kept evolving. FERC released Order 706, which helped dictate the aggregation of these types of assets. So demand is wishing to provide some sort of reduction, and so we have entities that are trying to gather this all together and provide it to your transmission operator as a lever or a program or a service, so that in times of need, there can be an automated, larger scale reduction in power demands. And we saw the industry track this. We saw that distributed energy resources saying that instead of just reducing demand, we want to start providing some power from typically our distribution or subtransmission type systems. And we see that IEEE standards in particular began revising some of their older methods in order to make sure that there was ability to deliver power onto the bulk system. Primarily of concern there was IEEE 1547-2003 and its addendum in 2014, updating into its culminating 2018 standard, which kind of has different categories to balance the needs of a distribution system and a bulk system. And kind of following off of 1547-2018 was the application framework, DERMS, Distributed Energy Resource Management Systems, that allow for software to communicate with and enable certain functions that are outlined in IEEE 1547-2018. So we're tracking this growth of a new type of resource, a generating type resource. And FERC released an Order 2222 for distributed energy resource aggregators. And so it defined DER, and it also defined DER aggregators, or distributed energy resource aggregators, in FERC Order 2222, which required all ISOs and RTOs to revise their tariffs to allow access to a wholesale market for distributed energy resources. And that kind of said, okay, the distribution system, as NERC and the transmission system has largely seen it, has evolved to a state where we need to address this is an entity or a growing type of resource, a generating potential type resource that may support either its local system or systems beyond just the distribution system. And FERC Order 2222 allowed that type of access into the wholesale market. And so that's why we brought the special assessment. While this was ongoing, FERC also released an order for FERC Order 901, and that's the standards related to registered IBRs, unregistered IBRs, and IBR DERs in the aggregate, to that effect, the bulk system. And so just want to compare, so that 901 is related to standards of certain IBR categories. FERC Order 2222 is the demand response, including DER aggregators, and it could include inverter-based resources under a DER aggregator's control. But the definition of DER is wider. In FERC Order 2222, it is not just inverter-based resources. It includes both synchronous and asynchronous type technologies, though we understand solar photovoltaic is largely the predominant DER type and the technology type of preference. We've seen some rises in batteries and other technology types. So that's where the tide may have come. But this report in particular is addressing the demand, or the distributed energy resource aggregators, or DER aggregators, from FERC Order 2222. So on to the next slide. This gives us the way DER has participated in events. So we had two different major disturbances, one in April-May 2018, and the other San Fernando disturbance was in 2020. We see this reflected that as DERs have evolved and updated from 2003 to 2018, we were starting to see the 2003 type inverters in aggregate tripping offline during bulk power system events. So you see the two charts here that shows net load jumps in specific transmission and distribution interfaces. And the bottom is an aggregate of all of these interfaces, and the top shows kind of the each individual interface. And we attributed roughly 100 to 200 megawatts of this net load jump. It follows that anywhere between 60-ish seconds to 5 minutes, there's a reconnection logic, and that was inherent in the older versions of 1547. And we have yet to see some of the modern reconnection and return to service as in 1547, 2018. But the major concern that we saw was we see this already happening when these are under independent type control, where these are just looking and monitoring their own voltage, their own inverter terminals, and taking action accordingly as 1547, 2003 would dictate. And we just asked the question, well, what would happen if all of these types of entities are now under one aggregate type control? And that wasn't really clear. And this is one of those questions that brought us saying we need to investigate this aggregate level of control capability that was introduced in FERC Order 2222. We saw that under independent control, we could see some response during major disturbances. It wouldn't be a major type of finding. We saw it happen in an event, but there wasn't a larger effort. But now we see an entity that's trying to gather these types of resources and leverage them into a transmission benefit. But we need to understand exactly what happens under that single entity type control. So next slide. We see and have developed a DER strategy related to how does the bulk power system need to incorporate aggregate DER type concerns. Again, aggregate DER concerns, talking about as this grid transforms from a very centralized space into a very decentralized, where individual homes can be producers of power, kind of changes the way historically the energy market and energy systems have operated, from energy flowing from the transmission onto the distribution system. Here we're starting to see more of an active interchange between these types of systems. The DER aggregator assessment addresses some of the more regulatory concerns on the NERC side of how do we deal with the entity that's going to aggregate on the distribution system and kind of have that kind of interaction between the transmission system and the distribution system at the T2D interface. Are there any NERC standards enhancements that need to change or are impacted by the introduction of this type of entity? And how's the cyber posture of this entity? Our NERC SIP standards are the loss of one individual cyber system, and its classifications and impact is based on the compromise of that one cyber system. So when we have an entity that may have system or systems that manage the flow of power in the distribution system that may impact the bulk system, we kind of need to understand its cybersecurity posture. And this report set out to answer those types of questions. As you can see, there's other efforts that still are underway for the NERC DER strategy related to modeling, studies, and operational impacts, largely covered by FERC 901 and the efforts underway there, as well as in other technical stakeholder groups. So this presentation today is going to focus largely on the DER aggregator and in those 4 boxes. Next slide. So as with any assessment, we need to as with any assessment, we need to understand what is the analysis criteria and how we're going to gauge impact to the bulk system. So we took a look and a review of our central reliability services, primarily on voltage support, the net demand response, and frequency response. The picture here you can see is a classical frequency response with a nadir following the arresting period, a little bit of a rebound up until a restoration period where you see PFR and secondary frequency response occurring. Each of these reliability services are important to have an interconnected AC system, which is our transmission system. And so we developed criteria that basically analyzed, does the introduction of this entity affect the ability of the electric ecosystem to procure enough voltage support, procure enough net demand ramping, and procure enough frequency response? Or is the entity itself providing any of these types of essential reliability services that can impact the ability of the bulk system to be stable? Furthermore, we developed criteria looking at our operators, planning domains, and in cyber and physical security. In bulk power system operations, we identified that we want to ask questions of if this entity is impacting the situational awareness of our operators, how operators need to normally operate their portion of the electric system, and any sort of emergency operating procedures that might be impacted or even benefited by the introduction of DER aggregators. So those criteria were developed, added to the rest of the essential reliability service criteria. We also identified that bulk power systems planners need to capture and fully plan a future year system, including this type of response from the distribution system and how the grid is transformed, and developed criteria accordingly related to modeling and potential study impacts. We also analyzed and asked what would the compromise of this entity potentially look like, and would that potentially fall within NERC SIP type criteria? And so we had developed criteria related to physical and cybersecurity. On the next slide, you can see the outcomes and just general descriptors of it. We asked questions, and here's what we would expect some of the responses to be. And it ranged from a variety of outcomes. So certain answers would tend us to, okay, this entity is impactful enough on the bulk system that we need to develop a clear registration criteria for it. We also had outcomes that says our standards need to be revised so that entities that are already registered shall incorporate the impacts and make sure that the bulk system is planned and operated in a reliable manner. Furthermore, if it was guidance material that's primarily needed, we had criteria that would say, let's develop guidance material to mitigate the risk. And as NERC needs to monitor risk, there is an outcome that not at this time. Let's monitor this and maybe come back at a later date. So these all results in the ability to identify, validate risks, and prioritize the risks and provide that outcome of this report, which is a potential risk mitigation solution, which was one of these 4 listed on this screen here. So let's get into the results. Actually, there's one more slide before we get straight into the results to kind of help set the stage. So next slide, please. When I was talking about risk identification, validation, prioritization, and mitigation, those are all tied into the essential reliability organizations. We lovingly called it the circle of life, where risks are identified and validated in the first step and the center top there. And it kind of has a circular impact where we've identified, validated that it is a risk that needs mitigation. We prioritize that amongst all those sets of risks, and then we determine whether or not any risk mitigation or remediation is necessary, deploy it, measure its success. Is there anything else that needs to happen? And going back through that cyclical process. So this special assessment is those first 3 stages: identify, validate, prioritize amongst all the other risks that are currently ongoing, and taking a look in the NERC space and determining what would be the best and most appropriate time for development and deployment of risk remediation and mitigation. And now I jump ahead into our results. So the first place on our next slide is that we took a look at the BES reliability operating services. So the next slide, please. And so we took a set of how many entities do we functionally register. SIP2 helped with tying into this BES reliability operating service into what entities kind of expected in the SIP domain, that is the impact of the entity and the way that they operate their systems, do these types of functions. So historically, we had the NERC functional working group that defined each functions. Since that's reference material, we looked at some of the SIP type domains and took a look at these entities. And we found that from FERC Order 2222 language, what most looked like a DER aggregator was this generator operator and a distribution provider, primarily in the operation, control, potential maintenance, or needing to coordinate with the distribution provider of that area in leveraging distribution connected assets onto the system. Furthermore, a generator operator, as we've looked at DER as resources. And so the DER portion of a DER aggregator would fall largely under generator operator. We also see that with the demand response programs and where data has largely fallen in the functional provision, distribution provider seems like they have a list of needs within reporting, procurement, etc. in the NERC sphere that the DER aggregator would mirror and find. But we couldn't really say that a DER aggregator was one, both, we weighed a lot of those considerations. And so we found on the next slide that the DER aggregator as laid out in FERC Order 2222, which was a fairly wide scoping, could be both. It could, in some areas, look like largely a generator operator as opposed to a distribution provider. And in some areas, it didn't really fall as an actual like even mixture. So what we found is that our functions weren't clear in how a DER aggregator is actually sitting across each of the ISOs and RTOs, and how FERC introduced it in 2022, as well as in the surrounding of how do we procure generation to meet load and balancing that load and demand. We found that it had largely an overlap, but we needed to identify that overlap as part of the risk mitigation. More on that to come. The other way that we took a look at this problem to answer some of our criteria of like the impact of essential reliability services tied to BROS, which is BES reliability operating services as protected in SIP, and then taking a look at the functional registration text was on our next slide, which was the FERC Order 2222 required individual ISOs and RTOs to revise their tariffs. And so we sent a survey. So the next slide, please. Sorry. We surveyed all of the ISOs and RTOs. This was a voluntary survey done at our request, and we received every ISOs and RTOs response to these questions, including all of the Canadian ISOs and RTOs. And so a large portion of this was exactly what's kind of the status of revising tariffs to include aggregate levels of distributed energy resources and the controlling entity of those resources, any sort of plans and lists of what is being considered as part of those. So I'm not going to linger too much on this slide, but those questions are available, are there. They're also part of the draft report and will be released alongside the report for the questions and individual ISOs and RTOs findings, as well as the summary. But I'm going to talk more about the key takeaways in the summary of those ISOs and RTOs. So on the next slide, we have from the review of ISOs and RTOs tariffs that are currently in effect, in progress, pending FERC approval or FERC order or FERC consultation. There was a wide range of progress and status there. We found that in those efforts, largely middleware or other third parties are a part of this sort of chain of commands that go between the issuing entity at the ISO and RTO into the DER aggregator and then disseminate to the individual resource itself. Largely, we saw that the chain of command or where the command is being sent could use third-party or cloud-type software to translate ICCP commands into DNP3 commands that can then be sent on more of a local network. So that translation software and being used as a cloud-type service, it raised a little bit of our questions immediately on the security side of whether or not that might have been an on-premise or off-premise location, but we found primarily that there was middleware or other third parties to translate the commands from the ISOs and RTOs into the DER aggregator and then from the DER aggregator to the DER device. That's important because FERC Order 2222 kind of limits the way that an ISO and RTO can communicate with the end use device. All communication goes through this DER aggregator and is left to the DER aggregator to identify how it sends the control signal to its aggregation. We also saw in the ISOs and RTOs that the market limits were existing as high as 1 megawatt for individual voluntary capacity. So there needed to be limits applied, and 2222 discusses that at length. Markets largely start at 1 megawatt and above. Okay, we see you now have voluntary capability to abide by market rules to help participate into the market as well. So by saying the limits are as high, it's saying we don't have market rules within the 0 to 1, but largely at 1 and above, you can participate if you want to. However, once 5 to 10 megawatts of that aggregation comes into play, markets said we start imposing some mandatory rules associated with that, which include telemetry, as they would treat it as any other resource as part of the market. However, sizing was at play here. So that was a key takeaway from NERC's findings. We also found that some state regulators have recognized reliability impacts of DERs on the retail side, in addition to saying that they should also take a look at the wholesale side. Some of those PUCs have found that there's like specific compensation associated with this. but we reviewed and saw the decision was largely related to market decongestion or transmission decongestion and alleviating flow in the transmission system. And so we found that that was a very unique finding and wanted to take that away, that we see that state commissions are already have acted on attributing specific value from the aggregate DER or individual DER sometimes to the alleviation of transmission constraints in the terms of producing of power. And so this kind of stemmed from a non-wires alternatives type process and proceeding, but was broadened into a larger aspect of generation of power and the alleviation of transmission constraints and transmission congestion, largely handled by our TOPs, RCs, and balancing authorities. Further, we found that the various rules for individual markets attribute different attributes for load only, generation only, or mixture of assets. And so we found that that largely confirms what we found in our functional registration review, that the markets have seen that assets that are being leveraged as part of load look different than generation and vice versa. However, this entity is allowed to combine both. And so we see that the rules, they vary in nature, but largely they separate the gen assets from load assets, and any mixture of those assets are accounted for in those types of rules. So it was a confirmation of our first findings that this survey helped reinforce. On the next slide, we see that we've found in our registration that this entity is kind of unique. We surveyed the ISOs and RTOs that are dealing with this type of entity and are required to revise rules to incorporate this type of entity. And so we looked at our standards, NERC standards, for how should we, or not necessarily how do we undergird reliability from our standards. And so our NERC reliability standards consist of these listed reliability principles. I'm not going to read them through here, but they're all listed. This comes from in our standards development documents, the reliability principles that are undergirding a good NERC reliability standard. And so these principles should be found in reliability standards. So we took a look at the impacts of each of these inside specific families of standards and inside standards. We didn't review the standards language for an entity that doesn't exist, or an entity that may look like another entity. We didn't do that type of review. What we found is individual standards have a stated objective and a stated purpose and specific mechanisms inside that standard. Those are attributed to these reliability principles. And so the introduction of the Aggregator, is there a change to the reliability principles or a change in how that process needs to account for the reliability principle inside certain families or specific standards? Just to take one for an example here, we see that the excuse me, sorry, apologies there, that the information necessary for planning and operation of the interconnected bulk power systems shall be made available to those entities responsible for planning and operating the systems reliably. That largely goes back to our criteria of the BPS planning and operational impacts. And so a review of planning and ops focused in on the processes to gather data, processes of planning data, and the processes of issuing any sort of result from studies of that data. Next slide, please. So we found that in our standards review, there was a few categorizations there were impacts by this introduction of the DER aggregator. Those were the performance of the DER aggregator and its assets. That's where performance under comes from. Those assets and the entity under operating instructions by the TOP, PC, or not PC, RC, and BA, as well as ability to meet or assist with TOP voltage schedules in our VAR type standards as well. We found in review of TOP, EOP standards for normal and emergency operations that the DER aggregator is a very unique entity there. Specifically in Black Start, where this entity may have the ability to assist in restoration of a distribution system, as well as should be fully listed in any sort of emergency operation procedure, regardless of whether or not they are assisting. So we saw that there's potential benefits in this area, but we also found that the schedules of coordination of restoration still need to be fully addressed by emergency response plans by the TOP and any sort of way for authority structures, when those get turned over back to the TOP, RC, etc. We also found that the planning practices that I alluded to before largely was a data concern as opposed to the development of models, which there was existing guidance on, as well as how to study. It's largely what type of data is feeding planning assessments, and that the DER aggregator is an appropriate entity to gather information on the assets it aggregates, which could help in producing higher quality transmission planning studies and thus improve transmission planning practices. So we found that that was a large finding in the performance under planning practices. We also found that the DER aggregators may have a unique role in identification of any sort of transmission misoperation and root cause analysis, where their aggregation, specifically behind a TDD interface, that production information is vitally important to identify where potential relaying may have failed, or misoperated, and being able to rectify that type of situation. Furthermore, the entire classification structure in SIP doesn't really account for DER aggregators. There's a long discussion as to why that is the case in the assessment, but to summarize, the DER aggregator is aggregating non-bulk electric system assets. Those assets needed to have been bulk electric system to be classified as a cyber system, and so the classification structure on cyber systems doesn't really hold for DER aggregators. We also found in market rules that they have a pretty unique spot in the command chain for how energy shows up in any sort of order given via ICCP. And so we identified that the classification structure and resulting impacts from how we would classify these types of resources needs to be fully understood. On the next slide is going to be the list of the recommendations. And for those that were following some of the discussion, it's not a surprise for how I was describing our analysis and where we found that here's our essential results. First and foremost, we found that the DER aggregator's function is unique. It reflects aspects of the GOP and the DP. So we find that it's unique. It's not like any of our other registration categories. We say it looks a lot like a GOP and a DP, but we say that it's unique enough to warrant its own type of category. Number two, that we found that the services the DER aggregator employs are operated predominantly from cloud-based systems without current applicable mandatory minimum security controls. Our cybersecurity experts on the team really helped in identifying exactly what type of cloud services are out there for DER aggregators. There's a conversation in the assessment about energy as a service that was large within the 2023-2024 timeframe. And many aggregators were implementing or advertising as energy as a service type, or the as a service crowd, using cloud architecture in order to aggregate data and disseminate any sort of control there. Our third finding was that we found that the ISOs and RTOs had telemetry requirements starting at the 5 to 10 megawatt range. And remember, voluntary had 1 megawatt or above to be able to participate, but we were looking at what was mandatory in control, and that was within 5 to 10 megawatts. We also found that the ISOs and RTOs largely treat the composition from load separate from generation, and that'll be finding, it reinforces our key point 1, but it also helps in our recommended outcome. On the next slide, we'll have our remaining sets of major findings. That impact that we found from the state regulator, we said that state regulator found bulk power system impact. They attributed via value for DERs, largely in the terms of reduction of transmission constraints and transmission congestion. Number 6, that we found that aggregators have an impact on the list of standards. I went through those larger, broader controls, but the list is there. We attributed a lot of these functions to IRO 1, 10, TOP 1, 3, FAC 1, FAC 2, MOD 32, TPL 1, the SIP family of standards, largely however we classify this, thus resulting in any sort of impact. For instance, if there's a new entire category of cyber systems, which could include non-BES cyber systems that are lower than low, whatever that might be called, that could be a way to account for and classify these types of cyber impacts. And further, we would need some sort of SIP family of standards revisions to account for that type of classification structure. So we left that one as the entire family of standards. Further, PRC standards as well for the identification of BPS protection and control. I went through misoperations. There's also how does the transmission system protection need to account for potential reverse flows and a potential revision of relay settings and or potential conditional settings. So that's the PRC family of standards has quite a bit associated with generation protection as well that is also part of this. So we attributed that the PRC family of standards is largely housing that type of performance. Further, COM1, COM2 for communications for operating instructions. EOP 4, 5, and 11 were largely for the emergency operational sides, and VAR2 for transmission operator voltage schedules. So that puts a little bit more meat to the bones of what's underneath for the A through F, but those are the large and main findings in our results. We also found, and I didn't have a chart here for you, but the de-aggregator growth, we found a few entities. We tracked one in particular that stated that within this year, there's going to be around the range of hundreds of megawatts of assets under its control. But they publicly were announcing that they plan to go to thousands or gigawatt scale program by 2035. I forget the exact year, but the size was of alarming to us, that we're starting to see operators that can control many gigawatts of power within certain areas or wide areas that may only have one entity of type control, where we don't really see how the disaggregation of that entity exists. So we were seeing that capacity is planned to grow, and entities are reaching that type of planned capacity in the not near term, but in the long term type planning horizon, if not a little bit even longer. So on the next slide is our next steps. So based on our findings, we found that our next step was to begin that registration process unique for the de-aggregator role. So this report doesn't recommend that type of role and define it in completeness. What we've identified is that there is risks associated with the introduction of this entity. We validated those risks against ongoing ISOs and RTO tariffs and impacts to our standards. Prioritizing that at a normal or medium type approach, we wouldn't call it low or no priority. And we wouldn't have called it high priority where we have ongoing risk mitigation from other high priority projects. So we prioritized it behind some of our higher priority work. But we would recommend that the registration function process kind of begin identifying some of the technical requirements associated with that risk mitigation. So we gave some guidance, primarily that the new function should capture its uniqueness, that it is both a load and generation assets. If we're doing any capacity bright lines, that would be, we need to differentiate the generation and the load capacity from those capacity bright lines. When we say there should be leeway to differentiate load and generation as subclassifications, we're talking about process. We're not defining that the de-aggregator function needs to include both load and generation assets here. What we're saying is that in the resulting registration criteria development, any capacity bright line should attribute generation and load. But what we also want to say is that if there's other subclassifications, we want to make sure that that is included as part of our next step here, that we're not just ignoring that piece. Further, we excuse me, we say that these bright lines should apply to the demand response aggregators, especially for the load subclassification, basically attributing to where demand response aggregators stop at the reduction of demand, de-aggregators increase. If we're going to have subclassifications, we should make sure that it's attributable to the correct entities. 2, that newly registered de-aggregator function should capture the way the aggregator communicates and operates that spans the transmission to distribution interface. In particular, we don't have that one point of bulk power system connection that we would have with a distribution provider, or even the distribution provider behind a distribution provider. We have a potential one-to-many here, where this virtual point of interconnection to the bulk power system can have many different electrical connections. So because of that, we need to make sure the data sharing and communication is clear to the success of BPS planning and operations. And so we give that as a guideline for the development of this new, unique de-aggregator role in registration. The third is that we should capture any cloud-based architecture employed for its integration, and reflecting those architectures in the generalized manner to the BPS security posture. The third largely would dictate that it has to fall behind in terms of where NERC and the industry is looking at cloud-based architectures for operations, planning, etc. And so this aggregator role is planned to use such architectures, And so we want to make sure that our registration function captures that well, but there may be predating type work in order to make sure that that registration function captures it appropriately. So because of all this and seeing that it's predating on some other type of work, on the next slide is a draft estimated project timeline. Again, it is draft. This is the sneak peek of a sneak peek here, where we're seeing that these dates, while not firm, kind of show where our team is kind of taking a look at here. It's intended to follow up work plan priorities after 2025 and 2026, 901 taking precedent, incorporate the lessons learned that we had from new registration functions from the GOP category 2 GO and GOPs. And so because of that, we would want to initiate sometime in the first quarter here to say, this is the process we're beginning. We would like to start seeing some engagement on Brightline's drafting of criteria early. And so that is, we need to identify the Brightline needs, steps to build the registration category, initiate the key stakeholder relationships, which this presentation being a potential one to leverage and disseminate this information. And then again, coming back to ask y'all, hey, what do we really need to do in order to make sure that this unique function is fully capturing its bulk power system impact? Continuing that research and really beginning in earnest for targeted research engagement between 2025 Q2 of 2025 into Q1 of 2027 timeline, so that in 2027 a lot of the work comes to light over the next 2 years, where we've engaged, we've tested, we've seen potential impacts. We're using the industry to develop this type of Brightline, knowing that it is not going to be the priority. So we're having a pretty long outreach and execution timeline. And so for 2027, roughly 2 quarters to execute at the ERO enterprise level, the industry informed revisions to capture DER aggregators. Then we would monitor any sort of success, document lessons learned, and close that out by the end of 2027. Again, draft, date's not firm. There could be changes and alterations to this timeline, but this is generally where we are thinking the DER aggregator would fall under in the resulting work that is going on. So if you haven't taken anything else away from today, this timeline here being draft should be one of the things. It's within the 3-year timeline. It's not within a year, but we would want to begin and have this DER aggregator registration function process move in a very methodical way that captures industry input before there is many gigawatts of DER aggregators. So that way it's very clear how this risk will be captured. So next slide. I've been asked to ask, well, what do we do in the meantime? This is a very long time duration. So this registration entity, we need assistance from every stakeholder that we can to make sure that we capture this appropriately and work through this in a very methodical and technology-driven and technical-driven manner. We also know that FERC 901 doesn't address DER aggregators completely. We know from the beginning, 901 relates to those 3 categories listed on the slide here. 2222 is not just these categories. So the standards revisions that are underway may leave some room on the table here. What we can see is that state action could help here, where DER impacts on the transmission system, or taking a look at 1547-2018, will assist in making sure that the DER aggregators in the technical repository of information available to registration is fully captured. Right now, DER aggregators are a fairly open type bunch. The assessment here does identify that entities outside markets look like DER aggregators. And so this isn't just a market type situation anymore. We're looking at this type of entity that may have started from a market perspective, but we really need to have the full technical repository of information where states can really assist in this regard. And in the meantime, come ready to deliver and define and derive Brightline thresholds for upcoming industry requirements. And I put on there, we really need to hammer down that virtual point of interconnection versus direct connection, as right now that virtual point of interconnection to the bulk electric system is largely a question here. And so in the meantime, we can help derive this that assists in defining what the DER aggregator registration criteria would look like. On the next slide, there's a list of additional information of the work that fueled this assessment, its findings, and particular in the DER strategy. It was used to help effectuate the other pillars related to modeling, verification studies, operational impacts, and so on. And so this should be available, should be able to be posted alongside this technical conference or this tech talk. So thank you for the time. I'll turn it over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, JP. That was a lot of great information, and we look forward to reading the report when it is published here soon. So thank you for going through those highlights that we can expect to see when we do get the report. We do have a few questions that came into Slido for you. So the first one I'll post out here on slide 22. You talked about some industry groups that were working on this, such as Spiderwig. What are those groups, and how does industry get involved?
Yeah, so since I have a different numbering, can you go back to the slide on screen so that I know where
Sorry about that.
Some of those other groups that I was talking about, the Spider Working Group, the RSTC, and the SC are NERC related groups. The rest on those are not NERC groups. But we understand that industry will also need to, we need to engage these other industry groups that are from the NATF, EI, and ESIG that have DER related activities going on. NERC Spider Working Group, you can send a message to me, john.skeath@nerc.net, to be added to the Spider Working Group distribution website. Or you can go to the nerc.com webpage under committees to get to the RSTC, the Reliability and Security Technical Committee. And under the RSTC is Spider Working Group, the System Planning Impacts of DER Working Group. This working group has its page under the RSTC. That's also has a link to say, please add me. That'll also send a message to myself at john.skeath@nerc.net or to our admin, levitra.pitts@nerc.net. To get involved at the RSTC, similarly, you can ask to be an observer of the RSTC. Send an email to me and I can get you routed accordingly. But to participate as an RSTC member, there's a nomination type process to consider. Standards Committee, same thing with NERC committees. There's a nomination process if you want to be and participate at the Standards Committee, although the committee is open to observers. More than happy to route that internally, but it's on a separate committee page. They have a separate way to sign up for their meetings.
Great, thanks, JP. I'm going to move on to the next question here. So I know you talked about how states what can states do in the meantime before all these pieces are put in place. And so the question is, what states have recognized the reliability impact of DERs?
Sorry, the question being, will states have or have?
What states have recognized? Do you have any thoughts on, what individual states are doing in regard to the reliability impact of DERs?
Yeah, so IEEE actually has a committee that's entirely designed around tracking who has implemented what parts of IEEE 1547 2018. That type of map used to be easily accessible, but what we've seen some work in Michigan. Michigan has adopted 1547. We've seen ERCOT revise some of their work, and for Texas, we've seen, so it's not really ERCOT for the state in Texas. I believe that's the name's slipping me, but ERCOT led it, and then it was implemented as part of ERCOT rules for DERs. We saw an engagement in Ohio for their public utility commissions. We've seen California Public Utility Commission. Also as an FYI, 1547-2018 did take a look at Cal Rule 21, and that's part of the category selection was the rulings in Cal Rule 21. That's undergoing some revisions. Hawaii Electric and the Hawaiian public utilities are also undergoing specific implementations of 1547-2018. I've seen Washington and Oregon begin. I don't recall their states or where they are in the process, but those are largely the states that come to mind. IEEE SCC 21 may have more information as to where each state is in the process, as they are tracking that closely. But what we saw was that roughly 11 states had some action or have pending regulatory decisions to capture the impacts. And so our recommendation is that if you are a state representative in those states, continue. And if you're not, to maybe take a look at how we can identify and quantify the impacts of DER in your local area, but also take a look at how the distributed energy resources may be affecting the bulk power system as part of that.
Great, thanks. That was great information there. The next one, along the same lines, because you mentioned Hawaiian Electric, and so the question is, did the review team look at other countries or possibly small islands that have a lot of DERs, and they seem to have reliability challenges without strong standards governing planning, operations, and maintenance? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the team didn't look at grid code requirements in other countries. The portion of the question that says that they don't have strong technical standards that kind of have that interaction. I don't know if the countries I'm thinking of are like Australia, Ireland grid code has a pretty strong impact, but the team itself didn't review that as part of this assessment. But the areas that we know that they have strong grid codes requiring how generation and load interacts with the bulk system, Ireland, United Kingdom, Australia, those are the few that come to mind immediately. Those do have rules dictating how the distributed marker, or the distributed operator, distribution operator, they have a bunch of different terms related to the entity that operates their distribution system, has specific requirements associated with distributed energy resources. That structure does not exist in the United States, nor FERC, nor NERC. So we do understand that there's other grid codes. It was not included as part of this assessment due to the large structural differences between how energy gets managed at the distribution level here in the States.
Okay, great. And last question here for the sake of time, so we could get on to Tim's presentation, but does the review team advocate for, this is in regard to registration of these DER aggregators, does the review team advocate for a subsection of GOP, such as Category 2 used for small IBRs, and a subsection of the distribution providers, such as DP/UVLS, or would this new entity or role be unique, a new name and registration that does not yet exist? Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, our team would recommend the latter of those two options. We would recommend, because of the uniqueness of the entity, that it doesn't get watered down by the other bulk actions necessary by other registration functions, which differs a little bit from the way Category 2 GO and GOP were identified, where in summary, very broad summaries here, Category 2 looked at Category 1 assets and saw that it was kind of like a scaled down version of those assets. Here we're seeing that it is largely a different operation function, largely a different way these entities communicate, largely a different way. It's just different and unique. So we wouldn't really see a subclassification, and we wouldn't have recommended a subclassification because of that. So we would recommend it be unique, stand to codify the T to D entities that sit between where we currently do not have some sort of clarity, and to derive that type of interaction and registration function. That largely will, on that virtual point of interconnection, we'll need to answer that. We'll need to also answer some of the cloud-based architecture that's used by these types of entities, which we don't really get into in some of our other registration functions. So a lot of our recommendations and findings point to this is unique. We need to step through this methodically, and it needs to be separated from not a subclassification of our other registration functions.
Makes sense. Thanks so much, JP.
Yeah, thank you all. I appreciate the time.